nightmares.
I couldn't tell you what day the outbreak started. No one really agrees on that anymore. Some count from the moment the national emergency alert blared through the car radios. Some say it was when the major networks went black, or when the highways locked up with people trying to outrun something they didn't understand. For me, it started the morning I limped out of a distribution warehouse with a torn ankle, a backpack full of someone else's food, and 3 infected men dragging a screaming woman behind them across the pavement, while no one moved to help. That was 5 or 6 months ago, maybe longer. I stopped tracking time when my watch battery died. The calendar in my head works off smaller things now. I know what time it is by how cold the air smells before dawn. I mark the seasons by how long I can sit in the sun before my skin burns. If I wake up with a metallic taste in my mouth, it means I drank untreated water again. If there are no gulls screeching and no insects buzzing, I don't sleep. It means something else is nearby, and it isn't me. Before all this, I worked at a tech retail chain just outside the city. Nothing fancy. I stocked shelves, showed people how to pair Bluetooth speakers with phones they barely knew how to use. I didn't have a savings account. I didn't have land, family, or any plan beyond paying rent, and maybe, one day, trying to learn something useful. When it started falling apart, I was still punching a time card, still trying to hit my sales goals while the morning shift manager talked about quarantines like they were a political stunt. I stayed inside too long, got out late. That mistake nearly killed me. I holed up in a warehouse supply depot for the first few weeks. There were 30 of us at the beginning, office workers, delivery drivers, a nurse who had shown up looking for antibiotics that weren't there. By the second week, the nurse was gone, and so was her patient. The food ran out in pieces. We took turns keeping watch on the rooftop, and one night someone set fire to the lot below trying to burn out a group of infected trapped in a van. That fire ended up collapsing part of the loading dock. 2 days later, a fight broke out over a half-emptied bag of lentils. I didn't stay to see who won. I left with a limp, a salvaged roll of duct tape holding my left boot together, and a cheap nylon backpack stuffed with canned fruit, rice, and 2 bottles of water. I didn't know where I was going. I just moved, followed the edge of the freight road until it became a 2-lane strip half swallowed by kudzu, slept under overpasses, ate when I found anything with a label I could still read, talked to no one, trusted no one. That's the only reason I was still alive. I didn't find the houseboat by plan or map. I found it because my legs were done, and I couldn't afford to walk in circles anymore. I was pushing through an overgrown trail just west of the coastal inlet, trying to stay off the main roads. My knee was locking up again, and the rice I had soaked the night before had turned sour in the pot. I forced it down anyway. The inside of my right shoe was cutting into the skin above my heel. The duct tape had come loose hours ago, and every step made the wound worse. The inlet appeared through a break in the trees, and I stopped on a rise overlooking what used to be a dockyard. There wasn't much left. A few broken crab traps, a collapsed shack missing half its roof, a wrecked outboard skiff capsized near the reeds. But in the middle of the inlet, maybe 200 feet out, was a houseboat. It didn't look brand new or even fully upright. The stern sat slightly lower in the water, like it had taken on weight over time or was just anchored poorly. The paint was peeling, and the railings had black algae climbing up their sides. But it was floating. It had structure, shelter, maybe even supplies. I crouched behind a rotted piling and watched for a long time. No smoke, no movement, no wet prints on the dock. If anyone had been aboard recently, they weren't home now. I scanned the shoreline and found a paddle skiff half submerged under brush and tide grass. One paddle still lashed to the frame with twine. I pulled it out, flipped it upright, and bailed out the water with a cracked bowl. The skiff didn't leak. I used my hand to steady it as I climbed in, then paddled out slowly, eyes on the boat the whole time. I half expected someone to shout, to fire a warning shot, to appear from behind the window with a warning. But nothing happened. I reached the hull, tied off, and climbed the side ladder. My boot slipped once, and my leg scraped metal. I didn't care. I was already bleeding from the foot, What mattered was what was inside. I knocked once on the cabin door, then again louder. Waited. No footsteps, no voice, no breathing from inside. The door was already cracked open, so I eased it wider and stepped through. The cabin was dark and smelled like moldy paper and spilled gas. Something had been left open too long. Maybe the stove. The galley was a mess. Dust coated every flat surface. Dried sea salt crusted along the window frames. I kept my back to the wall, scanning everything in short bursts. There were no bags, no blood, no signs of a fight. A pair of boots sat by the door, dry, caked with salt. I checked behind the curtain and under the bed before I let go of the hatchet. The photo by the helm caught my eye. Faded frame, glass long gone. A man and a woman, probably in their 50s. She wore a sun hat. He had a beard and a fishing vest. They were standing on this same deck, smiling at the camera with the bay behind them. I looked at it for a while, then opened the first cabinet. 3 cans of beans, a jar of lentils, 1 bag of rice that had gone soft from moisture, half a bottle of water. That was all I touched that first night. I didn't unpack my gear or unroll the blanket. I sat near the galley wall with my back against the cabinets and waited for footsteps that never came. I meant to sleep there just one night, just long enough to rest, check the surrounding area and push on. But when morning came, I walked to the stern, saw the tide receding, and decided to boil some water first, just to have something clean. The rain barrel was half full, but it stank. I siphoned a little out into a pot and boiled it. Drank it slow. Later, I regretted it. I spent most of that day curled on the floor with stomach cramps, sweating and shivering. I thought maybe I had made a mistake staying, but I was too weak to paddle back to shore anyway. I kept a hand on my hatchet, turned the stove off, and waited it out. That night, the boat rocked harder. The tide had come in rough. Something bumped the side around midnight, sharp enough to knock the plastic bowl off the counter. I crawled up and checked outside with a flashlight. A log had drifted into the hull, tangled in netting. I cut it loose and pushed it away with the paddle, then stayed up till the sky started turning pale again. On the second day, I pulled up the engine hatch. The motor had been removed completely. Nothing left but the lower mount bolts and a rusted coupling. No spare parts. Fuel tank was dry, hose cut clean. I knew then that this wasn't an abandoned fishing trip. Someone had stripped the boat on purpose. The solar panel on the roof was cracked down the middle and barely held its frame. The wires were old and chewed. I followed them to a dead battery box tucked beside the bunk. Nothing useful left there either. One of the drawers had a hand-cranked light, but the handle was snapped. I fixed it using a screw from the stovetop and got 30 seconds of weak light before the gear inside jammed. I left it near the window and sat on the floor until the sun came through. Once I could stand again, I started checking compartments more carefully. I opened the underdeck storage and found an old sleeping bag, a fish scale, a broken marine radio, and a folded-up camp chair. No weapons, no obvious valuables, not even spare clothes. Whoever left this place did not leave in a hurry. They took what mattered, or they never left at all. I climbed to the roof, checked the horizon, and watched for smoke or movement. Nothing. The marina across the inlet looked flooded. A few boats had settled sideways into the sand. One of the gas pumps leaned at an angle with algae climbing the side. There were no people, no infected, no noise except gulls in the distance and the buzz of bugs. I stayed up there till sunset, then climbed back down and boiled another pot of water with iodine I found in my own pack. I only took a sip that night, just enough to wet my throat. The next morning, I went back ashore with the skiff. I needed cleaning agents or something to treat the barrel. The bait shack behind the crab shack was still standing, so I made for it. The air stank of rot. I moved slow. Inside the shack, behind the counter, an old man in a raincoat had died sitting up. Looked like he had been there for weeks. Bullet through the side of the head, dried all down the collar. I didn't touch him. I took what I needed and got out. Bottle of vinegar, iodine, and a roll of gauze that was mostly dry. Back on the boat, I cleaned the barrel, boiled again. The water came out bitter but clear. I drank more. This time I didn't get sick. I stayed up the next few nights. I checked the tides. I tied the skiff properly. I went through the drawers again and found a small box wedged behind the sleeping bunk. Inside were 4 photographs. One showed the couple from the helm picture standing next to a younger man with a dog. The back was labeled Elroy, Nancy, and Matthew, summer 19. I kept the photos in a sealed tin and slid it under the bunk where the light didn't reach. Later that week, while checking for mold along the baseboards, I found a scratched message carved into the edge of a cabinet hinge. Still safer than land. I didn't disagree, even though this boat had its own set of problems. The hull creaked at night. The deck planks flexed in places where the wood had swollen, and the smell of salt and mildew got worse each time the tide rose higher than usual. But I knew what waited on shore. I had spent enough time hiding behind dumpsters, sleeping in half-burned cars, and walking through neighborhoods where every window had a hole punched through it. I didn't need a message carved into metal to remind me that staying here was the least dangerous choice I had made in months. The next morning, I pulled up the floor panels near the kitchenette to check for more leaks. The screws were rusted, and half of them snapped when I tried to loosen them, so I used a flathead screwdriver and pried the panel up inch by inch. The space underneath was cramped and smelled like old bait and grease, but I didn't see water pooling anywhere. I checked the insulation and the wiring, most of it brittle and falling apart. One section of wiring had tape wrapped around it so many times it looked like a cocoon. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't seem like the cause of any immediate danger, so I pushed the panel back down and forced the screws in just enough to keep it steady. Living on the boat meant fixing something every day. If it wasn't the roof leaking, it was the water barrel growing algae again. If it wasn't the algae, it was another drawer swollen shut from humidity. I didn't mind the work. It kept my hands busy, and it kept my mind from drifting back to things I didn't want to remember. People I had left behind, or people who had left me behind. I tried not to think about whether anyone from the electronics store had survived. I had been on shift that day, standing by the cash register sorting through a pile of returned phone chargers, when the first panicked customer came in screaming about someone attacking pedestrians outside the strip mall. Those days felt distant now, but not distant enough. Around midday, a dense fog rolled in from the bay and settled across everything. I could barely see 10 feet off the stern. The air felt thick and heavy, and the sounds carried strangely. The creaking of the mooring rope sounded too close, almost like it was inside the cabin instead of outside. I checked the line twice, tightening the knot and making sure the cleat was secure. The fog did one good thing. It muffled noise from the shore. I didn't hear any wandering infected, no shuffling or dragging, or sudden bursts of grunting. I hated that sound more than anything. Not because it frightened me in the usual way, but because it meant someone was still trapped inside a ruined body, walking without any purpose except to find warmth or movement. By late afternoon, the fog hadn't lifted, so I stayed on deck doing repairs and listening for anything out of place. I heard something small moving inside the cabin at one point, but when I rushed in to check, all I found was a half-crushed cockroach stuck under the leg of the chair. I tossed it overboard and wiped my hands on a rag that smelled like metal and seawater. Then, I noticed something I had missed earlier. On the inside of the cabin door, near the handle, there was a faint smear of dried mud. It was shaped like the side of a hand. Not a full print, just enough to tell me someone had braced themselves there at some point. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. Whoever lived here before me had probably touched that door 100 times, but this one stood out. The angle was odd, like the person had leaned heavily on it. That thought sat with me longer than I wanted. I walked through the cabin again, scanning everything slower this time. I opened every drawer, checked under the bunk, tapped along the wall panels, and listened for hollow spaces behind the wood. The boat had secrets. That I already knew, but I had not looked for them before. Now I felt like I'd been sleeping in someone else's bedroom, someone who might not have left by choice. I found the first clue behind the bottom cabinet under the sink. The wood there had warped unevenly, and when I pushed it lightly, it flexed in a way that didn't match the rest of the paneling. I crouched down, dug my fingers under the edge, and pulled. The whole piece came loose with a groan. Behind it was a narrow compartment barely wide enough for a toolbox. Inside were two things: a folded rain poncho stained with salt, and a stack of paper coiled tight with a rubber band. The papers turned out to be pages of a journal, or something close to it. The writing was cramped, rushed, and shaky in places. The top page was dated, but the ink had run, so the numbers were smudged. I could make out the words Dock Patrol and Motor Herd near Inlet. Nothing in the writing mentioned infected or anyone getting sick. Most of it seemed to be warnings about someone approaching the boat at night, checking anchor lines, or circling with a light. Whoever wrote this was afraid of someone specific. That bothered me more than any mention of infected ever could. I read the pages until the light outside faded. Some entries were barely legible, others more detailed. One mentioned Elroy, the same name I saw scratched under the hatch. Another mentioned Nancy, written in a clean, careful hand at the bottom of a page. No mention of the younger man in the photos. No mention of what had happened to any of them. The last readable entry ended with something that stopped me cold. Too much noise under deck again. Not rats, something else. I didn't want to deal with that sentence. Not while I was alone. Not with night coming in, and not with the fog thick enough to swallow sound. I folded the papers, slid them back into the gap, and reattached the panel. Then I made sure the hatchet was closer to the bed this time. I wasn't scared exactly, but I didn't sleep well. Every time the hull groaned or something tapped against the exterior, I sat up and stared at the floorboards under my feet. Half of me expected them to lift. The next morning, I forced myself to check the lower compartments. Nothing down there except a few dead crabs, tangled rope, and a damp smell that hadn't left the wood since the outbreak began. I did hear something faint though, like a shifting of weight or a small thud from the far end near the stern. I checked that area twice. Nothing moved. No signs of animals. No loose gear. I tried to tell myself it was just the tide, but I didn't believe that. I spent the rest of the day sweeping the deck and patching a crack on the starboard side, where water kept leaking in. The sun came out for the first time in days, and the warmth helped dry the damp spots inside the cabin. I took the chance to wash my shirt in a bucket with vinegar and rainwater. While it hung to dry, I looked through the photos again. In one picture, the man, Elroy, stood next to a cooler full of fish with a grin that reached his eyes. The woman, Nancy, held a mug and leaned against him lightly. That detail stuck with me. It showed how comfortable they were with each other. People don't lean that close unless they trust each other completely. I couldn't imagine what had happened that drove two people like that away from this boat. Late that afternoon, I decided to paddle closer to the inner marina to look for tools or spare rope. The place had flooded months ago, but some of the upper decks still stood. I tied the skiff to the railing of a half-collapsed dock and stepped onto the boards. They groaned under my weight but didn't give out. Inside the remains of the office, I found a small metal box with a corroded latch. Inside were screws, bolts, and 2 replacement hinges. I tossed everything salvageable into my pack. When I stepped back outside, I froze. Fresh footprints. Not mine. Not old. The mud was still wet where someone had stepped only an hour or two before. The prints led away from the dock toward a cluster of abandoned boat sheds. I crouched and touched one print with my fingertips. The mud was smooth around the edge, not dragged or smudged, which meant whoever made them had been moving carefully, observing, avoiding noise. The prints were light, smaller shoe, could have been a teen, could have been a woman, could have been someone barefoot with wrapped feet. I could not tell right away, but there was no dragging. Whoever it was, they were walking upright, which was worse. I scanned the tree line past the sheds and waited in place, breathing slow through my nose. The brush was overgrown but not too thick. A few sheds had collapsed roofs. The rest looked like they were holding on, but just barely. Rusted hinges, plastic windows warped from heat. Nothing moved. I kept the hatchet low and moved in. The closer I got, the more I realized how quiet it was. No gulls, no frogs, no wind. I paused between 2 piles of driftwood, listening. Still nothing. I turned toward the largest shed and took 2 steps around a corner and stopped. She was standing 10 feet away, one leg forward, face angled down, frozen like she had been mid-step and just stopped when I came into view. She was infected, not badly. Her skin hadn't cracked yet. Still color in the cheeks. No blood around the nose or mouth. Her eyes were cloudy but still moving. Clothes were soaked, maybe from rain or crossing a stream. Her arms were limp at her sides, but twitching. No obvious wounds. She stared straight at me but didn't charge. Not immediately, just blinked once, slow, and tilted her head like she was trying to recognize me. Then her lip curled. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and backed away one step. I didn't want to fight her, not for any moral reason, not because I thought she could be saved. I just didn't want to risk blood. One bad move, one scratch, one bite, and that would be it. But she was fresh, still had most of her gear, which meant she might have bandages, matches, maybe a canteen, maybe painkillers. I looked at her hip, a satchel. I moved left, slow and steady. She let out a low, wheezing breath. Then she moved, quick. 2 steps forward and then a lunge. I dropped low and swung hard into the side of her knee. She crumpled, landing sideways in the mud. I didn't wait. 2 more strikes, one across the collarbone, one at the base of the skull. She spasmed once and stopped. I sat back against the shed wall and stared at her body. Sweat soaked my shirt. My arm shook, but not from fear, just fatigue. I wiped the hatchet clean on the grass and crouched beside her. She looked like she had been mid-20s. Her clothes were worn but clean, still had both shoes. A loose bandage around her forearm. Maybe bitten, maybe not. I didn't check. I took her satchel, flipped it open. Half-full bottle of clean water, 1 sealed cracker, a worn flip phone with no signal, a small packet of wrapped tampons, a lighter with half a flick left in it, one of the small pharmacy-style pill bottles with 5 aspirin inside. No map, no radio, that was it. I looked back at her once more before I left. Her jaw was slack, eyes still open. I closed them with my sleeve and moved back toward the water. Not fast, just steady. I knew better than to run after a fight. That is when you make noise. That is when you stumble and bleed. I kept low, one hand on the satchel strap, the other still holding the hatchet. When I got back to the boat, I double-checked the deck, climbed aboard, and dropped the satchel inside. I boiled the water just in case, then took a sip. It was clean. The aspirin I wrapped in a rag and stashed under the bunk. The lighter worked twice before the wheel jammed. I'd try cleaning it later. I left the cracker untouched for now. I stayed up late that night. Couldn't sleep. The wind picked up just after sunset, and the boat creaked harder than usual. The anchor line was stretched taut. I checked it 3 times before finally settling by the window with the satchel in my lap, watching the water move. At some point, I dozed off. Not for long. When I woke, the air was colder than it should have been. Something wasn't right. The boat was tilted, off balance. I stood fast and felt the floor under my feet shift slightly, not the regular tide roll. This was different. The boat scraped hard against something underneath. I climbed to the roof and looked out. Nothing familiar. No shed, no dock, no inlet markers. Just reeds. Endless reeds. The boat had drifted miles across the bay, maybe more. We were wedged against the far bank, nose first in the weeds, tilted sideways against a shallow mud shelf. The rope was gone. I ran to the rear deck and checked the anchor tie. The rope had snapped. Not cut, just old. The fibers were frayed, exposed to salt too long. No one did this. It just failed. I climbed down and checked the skiff. It was still attached. I dropped into it, pushed off, and circled the boat. Hull was intact. No breach, just stuck nose deep in reeds and mud. Not grounded, not fully, but not going anywhere without some work. I climbed back aboard and tried shifting weight aft to rock it loose. No change. I stood on the rear deck with the pole and started pushing gently off the bank, testing different angles. Took 2 hours of shifting, rocking, and pushing before I felt movement. The hull jerked sideways, then floated free. I let the tide carry us back out slowly. I tied the anchor line again with a double loop and checked the rope length, worn all the way up to the knot. I took a knife and cut off the damaged end. Would need to find new rope eventually. Back on the water, I checked the sky. Grey light. Couldn't tell direction anymore. No phone, no compass. I drifted for an hour until I saw a rusted channel marker I remembered from before. That helped me reorient. I followed the edge of the deeper channel back west. Didn't go back to the inlet that night. Too risky. I stopped at a new stretch of marsh where the boat could settle behind a thick reed wall. No easy view from shore. I re-anchored, triple knotted, checked twice, then boiled more water and set out the satchel contents again. Looked at them one by one. Not as much as I hoped, but enough to feel like the risk had paid off. That didn't sit well. It meant I'd probably do it again, even though I shouldn't. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay flat with the blanket over my legs, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every creak. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her movements, how close she had gotten before I reacted. She hadn't looked gone, not fully, but it didn't matter. The infection didn't care what stage you were in. It just kept going until you weren't you anymore. In the morning, I found a spot on the bow where the anchor tie had been slowly cutting into the railing post. Just over time, little by little, rot and tension. It didn't snap in a storm or under pressure. It just gave out because no one checked it. Same way everything goes eventually. I spent most of that day cleaning the galley again, resealing the supply tin, and patching a gap in the rear deck where the molding had started to peel up. I used nails from the ruined crab pot frame and a hammer I found in a compartment behind the helm. The noise made me nervous, but I only used it in short bursts and waited between each strike. That afternoon, I fished, caught nothing. The hooks were rusted and the bait too soft. I made a note to check the fish traps marked on the old map if I could reach them. The tide wasn't right yet. I spent the rest of the daylight hours checking the seams of the hull. The slow drift the night before had worried me, and I wanted to be sure the boat hadn't taken damage while grounded in the reeds. I didn't find any breaches, but I did notice how swollen the wood had gotten along the lower edge of the port side. Water had been soaking in for too long without sealant. I couldn't fix that properly out here. I'd have to find a dry dock or pull it halfway up a slope, but there was no chance of that. All I could do was hammer down the worst gaps and hope the next storm didn't roll me sideways into a sandbar. I moved through the deck compartments again, checking for anything I'd missed. I opened one of the floor panels that I had skipped early on, the one under the mattress frame near the rear bunk. The hinges were stiff, and I had to pry one side with a claw hammer before it gave. The compartment was deeper than I expected. Not for storage, it was another hatch. The handle had duct tape across it, 4 layers thick, brittle from age. I peeled it back slowly. Beneath it was a rusted pull ring. I didn't open it right away. I sat back and stared at it, trying to remember the layout of the boat, judging the size of the space below. It should have been part of the hull's underside, probably dry storage, maybe ballast, could be nothing, could be mold and mildew and mouse droppings. But the tape said someone didn't want it opened. I waited until late, when the light dropped low. Then, I lit the hand crank lantern, turned the knob until it buzzed, and held it over the opening while I pulled the hatch. It creaked, then popped free. A wave of damp air pushed out, heavy and stale, not the rot of wet wood. Something else. I leaned over the edge and looked down. It was a narrow space, less than 4 feet high, maybe 6 feet deep. A small storage bay lined with vinyl sheeting. I climbed down slowly, one hand on the edge of the bunk frame, feet feeling for footholds. The lantern shook in my hand. I stepped onto something soft. Then I froze. A plastic tarp covered something large at the far end. It was folded roughly, stained. I crouched and moved it aside a few inches. What I saw first was the wrist, thin, with a red bracelet and dried blood crusted along the edge of a zip tie. I let the tarp fall back and stood there for a long moment, not touching anything else. It was a body, female, dead a long time. No movement, no sound. The air in the compartment made it impossible not to know right away. The vinyl was stuck to the underside of the deck above, moisture beads forming like it had been trying to sweat the smell out. But there was no smell in the cabin, which meant the hatch had stayed sealed for a long time, until I opened it. I went back up and closed the panel behind me, locked it with a bar from the window mount, and left the lantern on low, watching the beam fade through the cracks. I didn't eat that night. I barely drank. I sat by the helm with the flare gun across my lap and tried to sort through what I had just done. It changed the whole story. The blood on the rear railing, the stripped engine, the missing electronics. I had assumed someone had taken what they needed and left. But maybe they hadn't. Maybe only one person left. Maybe no one left at all. That woman in the photos, Nancy, that was probably her down there. I didn't sleep. The wind picked up again, and the water slapped gently against the hull, over and over. I listened to the rhythm, counting the seconds between waves. I started second-guessing every creak, every thump of something floating nearby. I had never cared about ghosts. Still didn't. But it felt wrong to be here now, even though I hadn't killed her. I just opened the wrong door. In the morning, I checked the sealed tin with the photographs. Flipped through them again, slower this time. One showed Nancy and Elroy on the upper deck, mugs in hand. Another had them sitting inside at the small table, a camping stove between them. No sign of tension, no fear, just normal life. In one photo, there was a younger man standing behind Nancy. Beard, short hair, pale jacket. Looked like family. The back was labeled Matthew Early Spring. He wasn't in any other photos. I found a notebook under the bunk, tucked behind the emergency blankets. Pages stuck together from damp. Half the writing had bled into itself, but I managed to make out a few entries. Caught 3 fish, tide coming in faster. Elroy says we need to pull anchor before the next storm. Might just wait it out. Don't want to go back inland. Tried to radio again. Still no signal. Battery almost done. Nancy's cough is worse. Using last of the clean water for tea. Elroy doesn't want to say it out loud, but we both know we're running out of time. Then a week of missing pages. Then this. We heard someone walking on the dock last night. Didn't answer when Elroy called out. Didn't knock. Just left. Still watching us from across the reeds. Last entry was a short one. I don't blame her. She did what I couldn't. It was her boat in the end. I set the notebook down and sat for a long time. The story was fractured, but there were gaps I could fill in. Someone got sick. Maybe Nancy. Elroy tried to hold things together. Someone else showed up. Matthew, another survivor. Something went wrong. Maybe worse. Maybe she killed him. Or he killed Elroy. Either way, she ended up dead in the dry hold. Someone sealed her in. I didn't try to clean the compartment. I wasn't planning to sleep down there or touch the body. I just resealed it, pressed the panel closed, and dragged the bed frame back into place. Then I opened the window and let the wind clear the air as best it could. After that, everything on the boat felt different. Not dangerous, just heavy, like I had stepped into a room where people used to talk, and now no one wanted to say anything at all. The quiet meant more than it had before. I worked slower, ate less. I stopped playing with the radio and focused on what I could fix. The old map marked fish traps to the south near a submerged pier. I waited 2 days for the tide to shift, then set out in the skiff with a net, my pack, and a hammer tied to my belt. It took an hour to reach the right spot. I found one of the trap markers half submerged under a floating plastic bottle lashed to a wood post. I pulled it up slow. Inside were 2 dead crabs, both long gone, nothing worth saving. The second trap was better. I dragged it up from the mud and found a striped mullet inside, barely alive. Tossed it into the bucket. Found another a few feet away, this one newer. Wire was less rusted. Still had bait tied inside. Looked like someone else had checked it not long ago. I scanned the shore nearby, saw no movement. The buildings closest to the water were empty shells. Hurricane damage maybe. I didn't go closer, just pulled what I could filled the bucket and turned back before the sun shifted too low. Back on the houseboat, I cleaned the fish, stored the extra in salt brine, and ate the rest with boiled water. That night, I sat by the edge of the roof with a blanket wrapped around my back, looking across the inlet. I thought about what it meant to stay, if anyone ever came back, if the wrong person found me here. I had only ever heard distant voices in the last few weeks, echoes across water, arguments at shoreline camps, sometimes the far-off groan of one of the infected getting caught in the shallows. But up close, I hadn't spoken to a living person since the night I walked out of the warehouse shelter. That silence had settled into something comfortable, something I could manage. I didn't miss the risk that came with people, but deep down, I knew eventually someone would come for this boat. It was near sunset when I heard the motor. It started low, barely audible over the wind, but then it rose, clear and mechanical, not the roar of a fishing engine, but the whine of something smaller, closer to a water pump or a lawn trimmer. I stood up on the roof and grabbed the binoculars from the coil box. There, cutting across the bay from the east, was a small skiff, inflatable sides, single-seat motor mount on the back. One man sitting low near the tiller. He wore a faded orange survival suit and a sun-bleached ball cap. His head moved side to side as he scanned the water. He wasn't just drifting, he was steering with purpose. I stepped down fast, stuffed the flare gun into my waistband, and moved to the rear deck. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, more from the weight of it. The quiet had broken, and I didn't know what was coming with it. The man throttled down when he got within 100 feet, coasted in. His boat made soft slaps against the surface. He didn't call out right away, just looked me over, one hand resting on the motor handle, the other in his lap. Then he spoke. "You live here now?" he asked, voice flat. I didn't answer immediately. He didn't raise a weapon or show anything threatening. No rifle, no sidearm, just a rolled-up tarp beside him and a dry bag at his feet. His eyes were sunken, red-rimmed, looked tired. "I didn't see anyone when I got here," I said finally. "Boat looked empty." He nodded slowly and stared at the hull, then at the rail, then up at the solar panel mount. "This used to be mine," he said. "Elroy was my brother." The words landed with a weight I didn't know how to process. I kept still. "I didn't take anything," I said. "Didn't know who it belonged to. I've just been trying to survive." He watched me for another few seconds, then shook his head. "I'm not here to fight you. Just wanted to see if it was still floating." He cut the motor, let the skiff drift a little closer, then reached down and tied himself to the side ladder. He didn't ask for permission. I stepped back, not hostile, just giving space. He climbed up slow, joints stiff, and when he reached the deck, he looked around like someone walking through a house after a fire. Not surprised at the damage, just disappointed to see what was still standing. "You find them?" he asked quietly. I didn't lie. One body, below deck. He looked down, didn't say anything for a long time. Then he walked over to the helm and placed his hand flat against the panel, breathing steady. "Nancy sealed herself in after Matthew got bit," he said finally. "Elroy tried to fix the engine, but it was already rusted through. I told them to leave with me. They said no." I listened, but I didn't ask questions. He spoke like someone who had already said these things out loud 100 times, just to no one who cared. I waited 6 days on the inlet shore, left water, supplies, even a signal fire. Never saw movement. I figured it was over, thought maybe someone had stripped it, took the boat for scrap. He looked at me then, not angry, just tired. "You're not living off much out here," he said. "No," I admitted, "but it's quieter than inland." He nodded, then sat down on the bench and unzipped his dry bag, pulled out a wrapped paper bundle and a bottle of iodine. "I'm not staying," he said, "not trying to take it back either. Just needed to know if it was gone. You can keep it. But if I were you, I'd move it to a different spot. You're too exposed here. Others come through sometimes." He left the bundle on the table, stood, and moved back toward the ladder. "I never found Elroy," he said, voice quieter now. "Only Nancy. If you find his body later, do what you can." I nodded once. He didn't look back after that. Just climbed down, untied his boat, started the motor, and disappeared across the water. I didn't unwrap the paper bundle until long after he was gone. Inside was a roll of fishing line, a spool of wire, 2 batteries, a folded photograph, and a few sticks of jerky wrapped in wax paper. The photograph was another one of Elroy and Nancy, but younger, standing on a beach, both barefoot, holding up a small catch between them. On the back, in blue marker, it said, "Don't waste the quiet, use it." I left the photo in the tin with the others, repacked the supplies into my kit, and sat down by the galley window. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone, but I didn't feel safer either. That man had come and gone without threat, but the next one might not. The engine noise would have drawn attention. I had to move the boat soon, maybe before nightfall. I checked the rope again, retied the anchor line, then started pulling in slowly, guiding the hull around until we could drift with the current southward, using the oar to steer. It took over an hour, but I reached a new section of reeds and narrow water that I hadn't used before. Less visibility, no clear approach from shore, shallow enough that anything coming through would make noise. Once anchored, I set a noise trap with a broken lantern chain and 2 metal cans tied to a string. Anything brushing that would wake me. I kept the flare gun near my feet and the satchel looped around my shoulder. No heavy sleep, just rest. I dreamed of the man's voice that night. Not the words, but the rhythm of it. The way he had said Elroy's name like it still belonged to someone out there. That kind of memory was a burden. I had avoided it. But maybe I was just collecting a different version of the same weight. I let the boat drift south along the river after that. I had no clear destination, just watched the shoreline, judging it by how overgrown the docks were, or how many collapsed fences sat half-sunken in the shallows. The farther I drifted, the quieter it became. There were no signs of people, no radio chatter, no floating debris from recent movement. Even the infected had thinned out. That didn't mean they were gone. It just meant I had moved somewhere nobody wanted to be anymore. Fishing had fallen off completely. Whatever had been in the traps was long gone, and my last few casts brought back nothing but wet weeds and tangled line. I gutted the last of the salt-brined fish and stretched it across 2 days, eating cold scraps in the dark and chewing slower than I had to. The fish stank slightly, but it was better than eating weeds or scraping algae. Water was never the problem. There was plenty of it, floating all around me. The problem was fire. The burner fuel was gone, and I hadn't found another match since the bait shack weeks ago. I tried to use the broken lighter from the dead woman's bag, but the wheel had cracked now, and no amount of cleaning would fix it. I had nothing dry enough to spark even if I got it working. Everything had been soaked by fog or morning dew. I started using a bottle of iodine again, but I knew that would run out. Boiling was the only safe way, and I couldn't boil anymore. I rationed what I had left. A capful here, a half pot there. The rest I drank only after straining through cloth and sitting it in the sun. It tasted like swamp. I caught a stomach cramp on the 3rd day. Spent the evening curled by the helm with a rag over my mouth, hoping I didn't vomit again. I slept with one eye open, not from fear of what was outside, but because I didn't trust my own body to stay still. It was late on the 5th day of drifting when I saw the rooftops. The sun had dipped behind the hills, and a narrow strip of blue light hit the water in front of me. At first, I thought it was just more marsh. Then I saw the steeple, metal cross, bent halfway, sticking out of the water like a dead tree. A few feet behind it, I saw the top of a stop sign, then a 2nd-story window frame covered in algae. A drowned town. I anchored in a patch of clear water between 2 collapsed utility poles. The current was gentle, still enough to hold me in place while I climbed into the skiff and started paddling toward the closest intact roof. The town had sunk unevenly. Some buildings sat chest-deep in brown water, others completely buried. I passed over what looked like an old pickup truck, half submerged with its hood cracked open. No movement inside. The The smell of old gasoline and rotted insulation was thick in the air. The insects were louder here. Every movement stirred them up. I paddled carefully between the broken buildings, scanning for anything worth the risk. Dry materials, signs of preserved food, hardware that could be repurposed. I saw a corner store with a partial wall missing. Inside were shelves tipped sideways. A counter collapsed into the water, and what might have once been a freezer chest now split down the middle. I tied the skiff to a street lamp and climbed in through the shattered window. My boots sank into the layer of mud and trash that covered the floor. Every step made a wet suction sound. I moved slow, listening for the wrong kind of echo. The store was silent except for drips of water from the sagging ceiling tiles. I checked behind the counter, pulled drawers open with a crowbar, looked for sealed goods, found nothing edible, just rusted cans that had split along the seams. One box of powdered drink mix sealed in foil, probably still okay. I stuffed it in my pack and kept moving. The next building looked like it had once been a gas station. The pump island was tilted, almost gone, but the office still stood above the flood line. I climbed the roof, found a broken hatch, and dropped into the upper office. It had been stripped. Someone had taken the shelves, wiring, anything useful. The only thing left was a melted phone and a stack of weather-warped manuals for oil filters. That was when I heard the sound. Just under the floor. It wasn't a splash. It was something brushing. Then another. Wet skin dragging over linoleum. I crouched immediately and pulled the hatchet from my belt. The floor under my feet creaked once. I held my breath and waited. The infected had been inside the station, probably trapped when the water rose. One of them surfaced from the back hallway, slipping against the corner as it dragged itself toward the open office door. The waterline had warped its skin, turned it grey-green in patches. Its jaw hung crooked, clothes stuck to its ribs in strips. It locked eyes on me and began to crawl faster. I kicked a loose chair down into the hallway to block it, then slammed the door shut and wedged it with the leg of the filing cabinet. I didn't waste time. I hauled myself back out the hatch, slid down the sloped roof into the skiff, and shoved off. The infected slammed against the window below me. Cracks spidered across the glass, but it didn't break. I paddled to a brick building with metal bars still attached to the front. It looked like a small municipal hall, or maybe a post office. No signs of bodies. The door was ajar. I used a piece of scrap metal to wedge it open further and waited. No movement inside. I entered and found the floors mostly dry. Some old boxes had floated to one side of the room, but a few filing cabinets were still bolted down. I cracked one open. Inside were emergency supply envelopes, sealed packets marked with dates from before everything fell apart. Most had been ruined by water, but two remained dry at the very top. I opened them carefully. Inside were iodine tablets, a foil blanket, a whistle, and a disposable lighter. I turned the wheel. The flame caught first try. That lighter was worth more to me than the entire rest of the trip. I packed everything and got out. I didn't want to push my luck. The light was fading, and if there were more infected stuck in these buildings, I couldn't fight them all in the dark. I paddled hard back to the houseboat, tied off fast, and lit the burner for the first time in days. The sound of the flame clicking into place brought tears to my eyes. I set a pot of water on immediately and let it boil until steam rose steadily. I dropped in a few drops of iodine anyway, just to be sure. Then I sat down on the deck, exhausted but steady. I ate the rest of the fish that night, cold but safe, then sipped hot water from a metal cup and listened to the distant sounds of things I didn't want to go near. The infected made noise sometimes, growling, gasping, coughing through wet lungs as they moved through water that slowed them down, but never stopped them. I had escaped them again, but not for good. This place wasn't empty, just sunken. Before I slept, I checked the hatch again. The compartment with Nancy, still sealed, still quiet. I don't know why I checked. Maybe I wanted to remind myself that there were worse places to be than drifting alone through what was left of the world. The morning came in slowly, grey and cold. I boiled a cup of water and drank it plain. The last of the fish was gone, and I was back to chewing dry leaves I found hanging over the edge of the deck just to keep my mouth from going stale. It wasn't hunger that kept me alert. It was something else. The feeling you get when the air's not quite right. When the sound of water lapping against the hull has a rhythm you didn't choose. I noticed it while refastening one of the tarp ties near the stern. There were drag marks near the edge of the mud where I had anchored. Fresh ones. The kind that came from a skiff being pulled onto land. They weren't mine. I always tied up. I never beached unless I had to. I dropped the line I was working on and followed the tracks up the bank. Not far from where the reeds thinned out, I found a small clearing that hadn't been there the day before. Someone had stepped through here recently. Footprints in the silt, thin branches broken where someone moved through with gear or a pack. A cold fire ring sat half-assembled near the base of a tree. The ash was fresh, still grey on top. I put 2 fingers into the pile. Damp, but not fully soaked through. Someone had camped there less than 24 hours earlier. I didn't call out. I stood still for nearly a full minute, listening. The tree cover above shifted just enough to let sunlight peek through. The river beyond the trees was still. No movement in the distance, no sound of paddles. Whoever had been here was gone, or hiding. I didn't like either option. I turned back and checked my own skiff. It hadn't been moved. The rope I used to tie it off was still looped the way I always did. Twice around, then through the ring. No signs of tampering. But that didn't mean anything. Anyone watching could have come up close enough to study the houseboat, see if I was on board. Maybe just scouting. Maybe not ready to approach yet. I spent the rest of the morning checking all my supply spots. The tin with the photographs hadn't been touched. The emergency food pouch I kept behind the helm was still buried under tools. But when I checked the roof hatch, I noticed the old radio had been moved. Only an inch or two. The cable that usually hung over the edge had been tucked back inside. That detail hit hard, not because it was valuable, I hadn't been able to get it working in weeks, but because it meant someone had been on the boat while I slept, or maybe while I was out. The idea that someone had climbed aboard, touched my things, then left without taking anything. That was worse than losing a can of food. That meant I was being watched, judged. I started watching the water harder after that. Not just the shoreline, but the river itself. I checked the wake behind the boat every few hours, looking for ripples that didn't match the breeze. I climbed the roof 3 times a day now, even when the sun was high and hot enough to sting. I started paddling the skiff in wider circles, trying to catch the glint of metal or fiberglass in the trees. 2 days later, I found something that confirmed it. Just past a bend in the river, half covered in reeds, was another boat. Smaller than mine, flat-bottomed, looked homemade, patched with sheet metal and wrapped in an old truck tarp. I nearly missed it. It had been tucked behind a sunken dock, out of direct view. No motor, no oars in sight. But the hull had a fresh scratch, like it had hit something hard in the past day. I paddled closer, slow and quiet, then tied off on a submerged fence post nearby. I didn't step aboard right away. I just drifted and listened. The boat made small creaks when the wind shifted. There was no gear inside, just an empty water jug, a folded wool blanket, and a knife stuck into the transom. Someone had etched letters into the blade with a nail or something sharp. Decker. That name didn't mean anything to me. Not at first. But I'd seen it once, in the notebook Elroy had kept. One of the pages I hadn't paid attention to. I paddled back to the houseboat, flipped through the pages again, and found it. Decker passed through, didn't stay, said he was heading south. Warned us about raiders near the lock gate. Seemed paranoid. Knew things he shouldn't. That was enough for me. I spent the rest of the day tying noise traps across the deck, hooks and tin cans. I laid broken glass on the roof hatch so I'd hear if someone tried to sneak through it again. I double-knotted the anchor line, then tied it off to a second point. If the boat came loose again, I'd know it wasn't the wind. That night, I didn't sleep inside. I took my pack, the flare gun, and a crowbar, and I set myself up in the skiff, tied loosely to the side of the houseboat. I figured if someone climbed aboard thinking I was inside, I'd hear them. If they were serious, they'd come for me anyway. Either way, I wasn't going to be taken by surprise again. The fog rolled in after midnight, thick enough that I could barely see the bow. The sounds changed. Everything got quieter. I watched the shadow of the houseboat like it was going to move on its own. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a splash. Not far, maybe 20 yards upriver. Not fish, heavier. I stayed crouched in the skiff, one hand on the flare gun, listening. Then I heard it again, closer. Then a low groan, one of the infected. I gritted my teeth and peeked over the edge. A shape was moving through the water just past the reeds. One of them, crawling through chest-high flood, hands slapping against the surface. It didn't see me. It passed by, heading toward the far shore. I waited another half hour before moving again. By morning, I still hadn't seen Decker, or anyone, but the presence of his boat meant he was near, maybe watching, maybe deciding what I was worth, maybe gone already. I pulled the houseboat farther into the narrow channel after that. Slower water, more vegetation, harder to reach by skiff. It was harder to fish there too, and it meant less visibility for me. But I needed a few days of silence. I needed to sleep more than 2 hours without holding a weapon. The lighter still worked. I boiled water again, burned damp driftwood until the cabin filled with smoke and then cleared. I ate dried leaves soaked in broth and chewed the last of the jerky Elroy's brother had left behind. No sign of Decker, no more notes. But I checked his boat again 2 days later. It was gone. I don't know if that meant he moved on. I only know I was still here, and the quiet returned with enough weight to feel like warning. Some things you don't run from, you just outlast them. The boat held. That was more than I could say about most things. The rope stayed tied. The leaks didn't spread. The dry food was gone. And the water was always on edge of being unsafe. But I was still upright. No infection, no bites, no real wounds. I was tired in a way that no rest fixed, but I was breathing. I couldn't keep the houseboat forever, but I wasn't ready to abandon it. Not yet. There was a routine again, in the last stretch. Wake at first light, walk the deck, check the traps. Usually empty. Treat water if I had fuel. Ration if I didn't. Scan the river for movement. Sit, think. Sometimes I tried to rebuild the solar wiring from the broken panel. Even though I knew it was fried, it gave me something to do. My hands wanted tasks, even if they failed. One morning, I sat with the dead radio and turned the dial just to hear static. It didn't matter how many times it failed. Some days, a man needs to pretend, and then something different happened. There was a tone, faint, rising up from the noise like a loose frequency someone forgot to close. I froze. Turned the dial back half a click. It was there again. Long, low, and mechanical. No voice. No words. Just an automated ping. 10 seconds on, then 20 off. Then it repeated. I checked the window. Sky was clear. No storm interference. No lightning. No fog. I cranked the volume slowly and listened for another 2 minutes. The pattern didn't change. Ping. Wait. Ping. Wait. I marked the frequency in the corner of the map with a pencil stub. 7.400 megahertz. I knew that one. That was the band Elroy had circled in his notebook. He had called it the fallback. Something set to broadcast only if no one was left to say the words out loud. I left the radio on and stepped outside. My first instinct was to look across the river, but nothing moved. It wasn't local. Couldn't be. No one nearby had power unless they were burning diesel or solar. Both loud, both obvious. This was something distant. Some relay. A last line on repeat. I sat in the skiff that night with the map in my lap and stared at the list of old locations Elroy had jotted down. A few of them were scratched out. One was circled but faded. Bridgeport relay mast. I didn't know how far that was, but if it was broadcasting, then it wasn't overrun. Not yet. I didn't pack immediately. I gave myself a full day to think about it. I didn't like rushing, not anymore. The old life was about speed and blind motion. This one was about endurance, about knowing when you had to leave and when you could still stay without dying for it. I boiled water that night, took it slow, ate the last of the edible reeds I'd managed to soak in broth, then checked the floor hatch one last time. Still sealed, still wrong. I thought about opening it again, maybe giving her a better burial, but I didn't have a shovel, I didn't have ground to dig in, and I didn't think she'd want to be moved, not after choosing to stay. Instead, I gathered every photograph, every note, and the broken radio into a sealed metal box I had cleaned out weeks earlier. I padded the inside with strips of a ruined blanket. Then I wrote a letter. No flowery words, just names, dates, facts. I wrote down what I saw, what I had done, who died, who didn't, what the boat had given me, and what it cost. Then I sealed the box with wire and tucked it into the dry compartment under the bunk. I marked the spot with a crosshatch in the wood. If anyone ever found the boat, they'd find that too. A record. Maybe not useful, maybe not worth anything, but real. I stayed one more night, let the tide rock the hull, let the sound of the river fill the silence left by static. I didn't sleep well, but I didn't want to. At first light, I loaded the skiff. I took what was left of the iodine, the lighter, 2 hooks, a coil of fishing line, the flare gun, and the crowbar. I left the radio. Its power draw was too high. I wrapped it in a tarp and stashed it inside the hull where rain wouldn't reach. I untied the houseboat slowly, like I was apologizing. Then I paddled away without looking back. I didn't want to see it get smaller. That thing had kept me alive longer than any plan I'd ever made. The river was smooth. I followed it east, hugging the curves, using old signs and broken channel markers to judge my direction. The ping came and went in my ears, looping in memory. Always 10 seconds, always the same. Somewhere beyond the bend, I'd find the relay. Maybe abandoned, maybe destroyed, maybe someone still there, holding down a button with a dead man's hope. I didn't care. What mattered was that something was still transmitting. Before nightfall, I stopped in a flooded picnic area and pulled the skiff up against a rusted fence. The water was too high to risk campfires. I ate a handful of dried leaves and rinsed my mouth with water I hadn't purified. The lighter sparked once, then died. I tucked it away, not angry, just accepting. I lay down in the skiff and watched the stars come out behind the smoke. They weren't as bright as before, but they were there. I don't think the infected ever looked up. Maybe that's what made us different. Or maybe not. Maybe we're just slower to fall apart. When I closed my eyes, I didn't picture the relay tower. I pictured the houseboat, stuck in the reeds, windows still intact, rope tied off tight, and no one inside. Just a sealed hatch, a quiet record, and water all around. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership. Carlos Herrera, The Great Anywho, Jadala, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, William Blackwell. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.